Hi everyone. We've got a brand new story to share with you, so let's begin. The moment I was sure my wife had stolen my credit card for a European trip, I knew she had crossed a line that would fundamentally change our marriage, though she had no idea that her attempt at financial deception had been documented and would come back to haunt her. After 12 years of marriage, I had become an expert at managing Jessica's expectations and demands, often choosing to accommodate her spending habits and lifestyle preferences rather than engaging in conflicts that seemed to drain energy from more important aspects of our relationship. Jessica had grown accustomed to getting what she wanted, interpreting my willingness to provide for her desires as evidence of love rather than recognizing it as conflict avoidance that had created unsustainable patterns in our marriage. My work as a consultant for financial institutions has provided us with a comfortable lifestyle that has allowed my wife, Jessica, considerable freedom to spend money on clothes, dining, travel, and social activities without requiring her to contribute significantly to our household income. Jessica worked part-time as a yoga instructor, a job she enjoyed but that generated minimal income compared to my consulting fees and the passive income from the software patents I had developed earlier in my career. For years, this financial arrangement had seemed to work well for both of us. Jessica could pursue activities and interests that brought her satisfaction without worrying about generating substantial income, while I could focus on building my consulting business and developing new technologies without having to negotiate household decisions or lifestyle changes with someone who had different priorities or risk tolerance. But as my consulting business matured and I began thinking more seriously about long-term financial planning, retirement savings, and wealth preservation, I started paying closer attention to our spending patterns and realized that Jessica's discretionary expenses had been growing significantly faster than our income. What had once been reasonable spending on personal interests had evolved into a lifestyle that was consuming an unsustainable percentage of our earnings. The wake-up call came when I reviewed our financial statements in preparation for a meeting with our accountant and discovered that we had been spending nearly as much as we earned for the past 2 years, leaving very little margin for savings, emergency funds, or investment in long-term wealth building. Jessica's spending on clothing, dining, travel, and social activities had gradually increased to the point where it was threatening our financial security and limiting our options for future planning. When I approached Jessica about implementing a more structured budget and reducing some of our discretionary spending, her reaction was immediate resistance and apparent offense that I would suggest limiting her access to money that she had come to view as unlimited. Jessica interpreted my concerns about our spending patterns as personal rejection rather than practical financial management, and she seemed unable to understand that budgeting was about ensuring our long-term security rather than punishing her for enjoying life. Jessica's response to my budgeting suggestions was to withdraw emotionally and physically from our relationship, using intimacy and affection as leverage to pressure me into abandoning my concerns about our financial trajectory. She would become cold and distant when I suggested eating at home instead of going to expensive restaurants, or when I questioned whether she needed additional clothes or accessories that we had discussed eliminating from our budget. The pattern that emerged during these conflicts revealed that Jessica had never learned to distinguish between love and financial accommodation, and that she viewed any limitations on her spending as evidence that I didn't care about her happiness or well-being. Jessica seemed incapable of understanding that responsible financial management was actually an expression of love and concern for our future together, rather than an attempt to control or punish her. What troubled me most about Jessica's reaction to budgeting was her apparent belief that our marriage entitled her to unlimited access to money I had earned, regardless of whether that spending aligned with our shared goals or threatened our financial security. Jessica seemed to view my income as our money when she wanted to spend it, but she showed no interest in participating in the planning and discipline required to manage that money responsibly. The breaking point came when Jessica's friends organized a luxury European vacation that would involve 2 weeks of travel through France, Italy, and Spain, staying in high-end hotels and dining at expensive restaurants. When Jessica announced that she wanted to join this trip, I calculated that her portion of the expenses would cost a lot of money that we hadn't budgeted for, and that would require us to use credit cards or reduce our emergency savings. I explained to Jessica that while the trip sounded wonderful, we couldn't afford that level of discretionary spending given our current financial situation and the budgeting goals we had recently established. I suggested that if this type of travel was important to her, we could begin saving for a similar trip in the following year, allowing us to pay cash rather than accumulating debt or compromising our financial security. Jessica's reaction to my refusal to fund her European vacation was surprisingly calm, which should have been a warning sign given her typical pattern of escalating arguments when she didn't get what she wanted. Instead of the emotional manipulation and withdrawal tactics she usually employed, Jessica simply said that she understood our financial constraints and that she would decline the trip with her friends. I was relieved that Jessica seemed to be accepting the reality of our budget limitations, without the conflict that had characterized our recent discussions about spending. I interpreted her reasonable response as evidence that she was beginning to understand the importance of financial discipline and long-term planning, and I was hopeful that we were finally making progress toward more sustainable spending patterns. But what I didn't realize was that Jessica had no intention of actually declining the European vacation. Instead, she had decided to fund the trip herself by using my credit card information without my knowledge or consent, apparently believing that I would discover the charges after she was already traveling and would be forced to accept her decision rather than creating a scene that might affect her vacation experience. Jessica's plan revealed a level of calculation and disrespect that I had never suspected she was capable of. She had listened to my explanation of our financial constraints, agreed with my assessment that we couldn't afford the trip, and then deliberately decided to ignore those constraints and fund her vacation with money she had no right to spend. The first indication that Jessica had implemented her deception came in the form of automated bank notifications that began appearing on my phone about a week after our conversation about the European trip. Initially, I assumed these notifications were related to fraudulent activity on my credit card, as the charges were for airline tickets, hotel bookings, and other travel expenses that I hadn't authorized or expected. But as I reviewed the specific charges and their timing, I realized that the fraudulent activity wasn't coming from identity thieves or hackers, but from my own wife, who had apparently memorized my credit card information and was using it to fund the vacation I had explicitly told her we couldn't afford. I had left her at home that day, and by the time I got back, she was gone. My professional background had taught me to respond to potential fraud with systematic documentation rather than immediate emotional reaction, so instead of confronting Jessica about the unauthorized charges, I began carefully gathering evidence of what she was doing and how she was funding her European vacation with my money. I started by downloading all of my credit card statements and bank records, creating a comprehensive timeline of Jessica's unauthorized spending that would serve as evidence of her financial fraud. The pattern that emerged was sophisticated and deliberate, showing that Jessica had researched the trip extensively, coordinated with her friends about accommodation and activity bookings, and systematically used my credit card information to pay for her portion of expenses. Jessica's social media activity during her European vacation provided additional evidence of her deliberate fraud, as she posted numerous photos and updates about expensive restaurants, luxury hotels, and high-end shopping that she was clearly enjoying with money she had stolen from my accounts. Her posts were tagged with phrases like "living my best life" and "girls' trip goals," showing no apparent awareness or concern about the fact that she was funding her lifestyle through theft. I didn't try to contact her while over there. The irony of Jessica's fraud was that her attempts to conceal her unauthorized spending had actually created a more comprehensive record of her criminal activity than any investigation I might have conducted myself. Every charge was documented with timestamps, merchant information, and transaction details that would be admissible in court proceedings. Jessica's social media posts provided additional evidence linking her to the fraudulent charges and demonstrating her knowledge and intent regarding the unauthorized spending. As Jessica's European vacation continued and the unauthorized charges accumulated on my credit cards, I found myself processing not just the financial implications of her theft, but the deeper questions about trust, respect, and commitment that her actions had raised about our marriage. Jessica's willingness to steal money from me revealed that she viewed our relationship as fundamentally transactional rather than based on mutual respect and shared responsibility. She had decided that her desire for a luxury vacation was more important than honesty, consent, or financial responsibility, and she had been confident that I would ultimately accept her theft rather than hold her accountable for criminal behavior. What disturbed me most about Jessica's fraud wasn't just the money she had stolen, but the calculated nature of her deception and her apparent confidence that I would forgive her criminal behavior just as I had forgiven years of financial irresponsibility and emotional manipulation. Jessica had correctly assessed that I had been enabling her poor decisions by prioritizing peace over accountability, but she had miscalculated how I would respond to outright theft. I realized that Jessica's credit card fraud was the inevitable result of years of my failure to establish and maintain appropriate boundaries around financial responsibility and mutual respect. By consistently choosing accommodation over confrontation, I had taught Jessica that she could escalate her demands and poor behavior without facing meaningful consequences. The pattern I recognized was that every time Jessica had pushed boundaries and I had chosen to accommodate her rather than enforce consequences, I had inadvertently taught her that my stated limits were negotiable and that persistence or manipulation would eventually get her what she wanted. Jessica's credit card theft was simply the latest escalation in a pattern of testing limits that I had been failing to enforce for years. During the 2 weeks that Jessica spent in Europe posting photos of her stolen vacation on social media, I used my time to consult with attorneys and financial advisors about my legal options and the best strategies for protecting my assets and holding Jessica accountable for her criminal behavior. The attorneys I consulted confirmed that Jessica's unauthorized use of my credit card information constituted criminal fraud regardless of our marital status, and that the evidence I had gathered would be more than sufficient to support criminal charges if I chose to pursue them. They also advised me about civil remedies for recovering the stolen money and protecting my assets from future unauthorized access. My financial advisor helped me understand the steps necessary to secure my accounts and prevent Jessica from continuing to access money without my authorization. We implemented new security measures, including changed passwords, new account numbers, and additional verification requirements that would prevent Jessica from continuing to use my financial information fraudulently. When Jessica returned from her European vacation, tanned and apparently refreshed from her stolen holiday, she seemed to expect that I would ask about her trip and give her an opportunity to minimize or justify what she had done. Jessica's demeanor suggested that she believed I would probably be angry about her unauthorized spending, but that she could manage my reaction through a combination of denial, emotional manipulation, and eventual apologies that would restore our relationship to its previous patterns. But I had decided that Jessica's credit card fraud represented a line that I wouldn't allow her to cross without meaningful consequences, and that her theft had fundamentally changed the nature of our relationship in ways that couldn't be repaired through the kind of superficial reconciliation that had characterized our previous conflicts. Instead of giving Jessica the opportunity to control the narrative about her theft, I waited until we were having dinner at home and calmly placed printed copies of all the unauthorized credit card charges in front of her, along with screenshots of her social media posts that documented her enjoyment of the vacation she had funded through fraud. I explained to Jessica that I hadn't refused to fund her European vacation because I wanted to control her or prevent her from enjoying herself, but because we genuinely couldn't afford that level of discretionary spending given our financial goals and constraints. Instead of respecting my assessment or working with me to find alternative solutions, Jessica chose to steal the money she wanted and fund her vacation through criminal fraud. Jessica's initial reaction was to deny that she had done anything wrong, claiming that she couldn't steal from her own husband and that using family credit cards for family expenses was normal behavior in marriage. When I pointed out that unauthorized use of credit card information constitutes fraud regardless of marital status, Jessica became defensive and began trying to shift responsibility for her theft onto me. According to Jessica's revised narrative, I had embarrassed her by refusing to fund her vacation, leaving her with no choice but to find the money herself through whatever means were available. Jessica claimed that she had been put in an impossible position by my financial constraints, and that her theft was actually a reasonable response to my unreasonable refusal to accommodate her travel desires. Jessica's attempts to justify her theft by blaming me for creating the circumstances that led to her criminal behavior revealed the depth of her entitlement and her inability to accept responsibility for the choices she had made deliberately and with full knowledge of their illegality. I explained to Jessica that I had already consulted with attorneys about my legal options regarding her credit card fraud, and that I had the right to press criminal charges that could result in her arrest and prosecution for theft. The evidence I had gathered, including bank records, credit card statements, and her own social media posts, provided clear documentation of her criminal activity that would be admissible in court proceedings. Jessica's reaction to learning about the potential legal consequences of her theft was panic and disbelief rather than remorse or accountability. She seemed genuinely shocked that I would consider treating her criminal act as criminal behavior, apparently having assumed that our marital relationship provided her with immunity from consequences for fraud and theft. But I had moved beyond the point where Jessica's emotional manipulation or expressions of surprise could influence my response to her criminal behavior. Jessica had made calculated decisions about stealing money and funding her vacation through fraud, and those decisions had legal and practical consequences that I was no longer willing to protect her from experiencing. Instead of pressing charges immediately, I implemented a comprehensive strategy for protecting my financial assets and creating accountability for Jessica's criminal behavior. I froze all of our joint accounts and implemented additional security measures that would prevent her from continuing to access money without my explicit authorization. I also presented Jessica with a clear ultimatum. She could choose to accept responsibility for her theft, participate in marriage counseling focused on financial responsibility and communication, and work to rebuild trust that she had destroyed through her criminal behavior, or she could face the legal consequences of her fraud through criminal charges and divorce proceedings. Jessica's response to my ultimatum was continued denial and defensiveness, insisting that my efforts to protect my financial assets were evidence of controlling behavior rather than reasonable responses to her documented theft and fraud. Jessica seemed unable or unwilling to understand that her criminal behavior had fundamentally changed our relationship and required meaningful changes in her attitude and behavior. When it became clear that Jessica had no intention of accepting responsibility for her theft or working to rebuild trust in our marriage, I followed through on the consequences I had outlined, pressing criminal charges for credit card fraud and filing for divorce based on financial betrayal and irreconcilable differences. The criminal charges against Jessica were supported by the comprehensive evidence I had gathered during her European vacation, and her social media posts provided additional confirmation of her knowledge and intent regarding the fraudulent spending. Jessica's attempts to claim that she had been authorized to use my credit card information were contradicted by the clear record of our conversations about budget constraints and my explicit refusal to fund her vacation. The divorce proceedings were complicated by Jessica's attempts to claim entitlement to assets that I had accumulated before our marriage and that she had never contributed to acquiring or maintaining. However, the money Jessica had stolen for her European vacation was deducted from her share of our marital assets, effectively requiring her to repay the funds through reduced settlement rather than direct reimbursement. Jessica's reaction to facing real consequences for her criminal behavior was continued disbelief and attempts to portray herself as the victim of my unreasonable financial control, rather than accepting responsibility for the choices she had made with full knowledge of their illegality. Even when confronted with comprehensive evidence of her fraud and theft, Jessica maintained that she had been justified in stealing money because I had been unreasonable in refusing to fund her vacation voluntarily. The experience of holding Jessica accountable for her criminal behavior taught me important lessons about the difference between love and enabling, and about the importance of establishing and maintaining boundaries that protect both partners from destructive patterns of behavior. I learned that my years of accommodating Jessica's financial irresponsibility and emotional manipulation had actually been harmful to both of us, creating patterns of entitlement and disrespect that had ultimately led to criminal behavior. By consistently choosing peace over accountability, I had taught Jessica that she could escalate her poor behavior without facing meaningful consequences. The expertise that I had developed in my professional career had provided me with the knowledge and tools necessary to follow Jessica's fraud comprehensively and respond to her criminal behavior with legal precision rather than emotional reaction. Without that technical background, I might have been less successful in gathering evidence and protecting my assets from further unauthorized access. Most importantly, I discovered that some boundary violations are so fundamental that they cannot be overcome through forgiveness and renewed effort, and that criminal behavior requires legal responses regardless of the relationship between the perpetrator and victim. Jessica's credit card fraud had revealed character traits and attitudes that made a genuine partnership impossible. The months following my divorce from Jessica allowed me to gain perspective on the warning signs I had ignored during our marriage and to understand how my conflict avoidance had contributed to creating unsustainable relationship dynamics. Jessica's sense of entitlement to unlimited access to money she hadn't earned had been developing for years, but I had been too focused on maintaining peace to address the underlying attitudes that led to her theft. Looking back on the bank notifications that first alerted me to Jessica's credit card fraud, I realized that discovering her theft was actually a blessing that revealed the documented true nature of our relationship. She viewed me primarily as a source of funding for her lifestyle, rather than as a partner deserving of respect and honesty. Jessica's confidence that she could steal money and face no consequences had been based on years of my failure to establish appropriate boundaries and hold her accountable for increasingly problematic behavior. Her European vacation, funded through credit card fraud, had finally provided clear evidence of attitudes and behaviors that had been developing throughout our marriage. The woman who had stolen my credit card information to fund a luxury vacation had ultimately stolen her way out of a marriage with someone who had been willing to provide for her appropriately, but who wouldn't tolerate criminal behavior. Jessica's fraud had ended our relationship, but it had also freed me from continuing to enable someone whose entitlement and disrespect had been escalating over time. The European vacation that Jessica thought she had cleverly funded through theft had actually created the comprehensive evidence necessary to hold her accountable for criminal behavior and end a marriage that had been built on unsustainable financial arrangements and mutual disrespect. Sometimes the most destructive choices people make also create the clearest opportunities for necessary change and growth. My expertise has taught me that the best defense against fraud is comprehensive monitoring and rapid response to suspicious activity, principles that apply equally to personal relationships and professional security. Jessica's credit card theft had been detected, documented, and addressed with the same systematic approach I used to protect corporate clients from financial crimes. The marriage that had once seemed stable and comfortable had actually been characterized by patterns of enabling and entitlement that made genuine partnership impossible. Jessica's credit card fraud had simply been the most obvious manifestation of deeper problems that had been developing throughout our relationship, and addressing her criminal behavior had required ending a marriage that couldn't be repaired through conventional means. The evidence-gathering process that had documented Jessica's fraud had also revealed the extent to which I had been failing to protect my own interests and maintain appropriate boundaries throughout our marriage. Jessica's theft had been enabled by my failure to implement reasonable security measures and hold her accountable for increasingly problematic financial behavior. The lesson that emerged from Jessica's credit card fraud was that love and accountability aren't mutually exclusive, and that protecting someone from consequences of their bad behavior actually harms them by preventing the learning and growth that come from experiencing appropriate outcomes for poor choices. Jessica's European vacation had been funded through theft, but the true cost had been the end of our marriage and the legal consequences of her criminal behavior.